Hello, I'm Roger Ream. Thanks for joining us for this conversation with Congressman Ron Paul. Congressman Paul's guest today is Dominic Armentano, Professor of Economics at the University of Hartford. Professor Armentano is a leading authority on antitrust and monopoly and is the author of 2 books on the subject. Professor Armentano, you've done a great deal of research on antitrust and monopoly. Do we really need laws to protect us against monopoly?
No, I don't think we do. I think monopoly is a serious problem, but I don't think the antitrust laws protect us from monopoly. The source of monopoly is governmental power, and the antitrust laws are really irrelevant to that particular issue.
Congressman Paul, do you agree?
I certainly do, and it's one of those points of view that I've changed my mind on. I would have to say that maybe 15 or 20 years ago, after leaving college and having studied economics at college a bit, I would have said absolutely they're necessary. This is what I had been told. But I think over the years in studying and reading some of Professor Armentano's works, I've been convinced. I'm convinced that the legislation against monopoly is much more harmful than helpful. I think they serve a purpose which is contrary to what we want. If we are against monopoly, we should be making sure that government doesn't protect monopoly. And here we go this pretense that we're always breaking up monopoly, and yet we're always protecting monopolies. And I think it's very disturbing, because generally people are opposed to monopolies and they see there's a lot of power, but they don't quite understand how this operates and how government really gives the power to the big companies.
Professor Armentano, let's start with some basics. What are antitrust laws?
Well, the oldest antitrust law is the Sherman Antitrust Act. It's 93 years old. It's our oldest industrial policy, actually. And that law deals with conspiracies and restraint of trade and attempts to monopolize. The other major piece of legislation is the Clayton Act, passed in 1914, which basically bans or restricts price discrimination, so-called tying agreements, and mergers.
Do businessmen support these laws?
I think businessmen generally do support these laws, which should make us leery as to the actual intent and purpose of the antitrust laws. Businessmen generally support the antitrust laws. In fact, most of the time, the laws are employed by businessmen, by corporations, against other corporations. I think a little-known fact is that 95% of all the antitrust cases that are not brought by the government, but are brought by one firm suing another firm. And usually the defendant company is a company that's aggressively competitive, so that the company that's being sued is making life competitively rough for the company that's suing it.
So what you're saying is they're literally using these laws in a perverse way. Instead of breaking up a monopoly, they're using those to secure the monopoly or secure protection for themselves.
That's right. The laws actually are protectionist in effect. Although the intent is to preserve competition and promote it, the effect of the laws is to restrain and restrict competition. So the laws, like a lot of laws, achieve the opposite of the result intended.
Congressman Paul, you're an advocate of the free market and the free market economy. Therefore, I assume you believe competition is important. Isn't there a role for government to ensure that we have competition in the marketplace?
Yes, I think so. And I think as long as you enforce the law equally, and that is protect freedom for everybody across the board, then you're going to have competition. If you protect the concept of the voluntary contract, which I think people have just about forgotten about, that you can't today easily draw up a contract which the government doesn't interfere in. They're always telling you what you can do and what you can't do and who you can hire and what you should pay them. So they're always interfering with this voluntarism in the market. So I would say there's a lot government could do, but it's almost in a negative way, that is to prohibit the monopoly from developing by special privilege. But yes, they have a role to play, but not by passing a law telling that a company can't get any bigger. That's where I see the harm, where they say that 70% or 80% is too big and then it's therefore it's harmful. Because this is the market telling us something. What we're doing is literally destroying an important piece of information. And that is that if you're getting big, you're usually getting big because you're doing something for the consumer. And the consumer should be the deciding factor. If you're not doing the job right, if you're not providing the right commodity at the right price, that businessman will go out of business. But today, if you get too big because you've satisfied a lot of consumers, then the government comes in and wants to interrupt this. And also they want to overtax you. In another sense, if a company is weak, because they're inefficient, we literally go in and we subsidize them. So I think we do exactly the opposite thing. The government certainly has a role to play, but it's quite a bit different than the role that we take here in Washington.
Well, Dr. Armentano, without antitrust laws, wouldn't businesses conspire at the expense of the consumer?
Well, I think we have to remember that prior to 1890, there were no antitrust laws. And what I always challenge people to do is find an effective case, or find an example of effective conspiracy prior to the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now, we know that businessmen rarely get together but that they hatch a conspiracy against the public, to quote Adam Smith. But the point is, these conspiracies are usually very short-lived. The railroads, prior to the passage of the Sherman Act, used to attempt to fix rates. And they were so unsuccessful at it that they demanded the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission, which effectively fixed rates for almost 100 years. So I think that businessmen can and do cooperate. You can call it collusion if you want to, which I think is a pejorative term. But I don't think normally in open markets attempts to conspire are injurious to the consumer's welfare.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you agree, Congressman?
Yeah, I certainly do. I've been wondering about one thing that I never had a full explanation on, and that is with the monopoly that occurs sometimes in a free market. Are they necessarily bad? Now, what is the answer to that? Aren't there times when government doesn't interfere that a company might provide 99% of a product, and yet it seems to have a market price to it? Where does that market price come from if there's nobody else producing that product?
Well, I think you gave the answer before. It's certainly not bad. If I produce a product and do it so successfully, let's say by lowering my price and improving the quality and advertising the product effectively, such that my market share expands so that consumers refuse to buy, let's say, substitute products from other producers so that I get the whole market. If that's the way the monopoly is achieved, then I would put quotes around the use of monopoly in that sense. That's what I call a free market monopoly. Now, that's very rare. Normally, firms are not able to anticipate consumer demand and supplier costs and innovation to the extent that they are always successful and therefore achieve a market position where there's no other competitors. But there's nothing regrettable about the fact that a firm can do it. Alcoa is a good example of a firm that retained, in some sense, depending on how you define the market, a 100% market share. But they did it by lowering the price and expanding the output and improving the quality of the product.
So they literally have to not only compete against other aluminum makers, they have to compete against other products as well.
Sure.
And also knowing if their price gets too high, that's going to invite somebody else coming in, so they have an incentive, even though he doesn't exist, keep that price at a market level.
Potential competition. When aluminum came on the market, it sold for $8 an ingot pound. Now, that's not going to compete with other structural materials in the market, so what Alcoa did is reduce the price progressively over 50 years so that at the time of the antitrust case against Alcoa, it was selling for 22 cents a pound. Now, they were convicted for monopolizing aluminum, even though they had reduced the price and increased the output.
Well, this raises a question about what we should be doing here in Washington. Of course, you and I might agree we ought to get rid of the laws, but isn't it practically impossible for even the most sincere businessman to interpret the laws? Because if the price is all the same, we're in collusion. If it's too high, that means we control it and we're gouging in public. If it's too low, we're trying to kill our competitors. It seems like the government can say that you're defying the antitrust laws no matter what you do.
The laws are arbitrary. The laws are unjust, therefore. You know, even Adam Smith didn't think we needed a law against price fixing because he said, I don't think you can enforce a law like that consistent with liberty and justice. You'll inevitably interfere with the liberty and justice of business people because the laws are so arbitrary and unfair. They're ex post facto laws. Also, you only find out what you've done after you've done it.
If businessmen are making use of these laws, and we can see how they do this, and we really have monopolies because they have government protection, why don't we have our consumer groups doing more for the consumer? Obviously, it hurts the consumer to have these laws on the books and to protect big business and their monopolies. It seems like it should be consumerism. And why are we missing the boat? Why is it the marketplace hasn't protected the consumer, at least been an advocate of the consumer? That to me seems to be a political plus for us if we could only do that, and yet we don't translate that into consumerism.
I think consumerism is picking up on the antitrust laws. I think the antitrust laws were a myth and a hoax for 80 years. But beginning around 10 years ago, there's been a lot of work in this area. I'm not alone in arguing that the antitrust laws are anti-consumer and have worked in an anti-consumer way. And you've had a lot of people in the consumerist movement